Hello and welcome to IHBC at COP26. Conserving buildings and places conserves our planet. Today we're joined by Joanna Saady. Jo is a chartered architect, has a Master's of Science in Energy Efficient Building, and a postgraduate certification in Conservation of the Historic Environment. She is also a full member of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation. Her firm, EcoTexture, delivers projects including house remodeling, large extensions retrofits, bespoke one-off house designs, master planning, and small estate planning, community projects, and commercial offices. She performs a range of design solutions in traditional, historic, and contemporary design. Well, welcome, Jo. Thank you for being with us today.
Good afternoon, Michael.
Well, I'd like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started and why you're passionate about sustainability and conservation.
Okay, so first of all, I ought to have said this in the beginning. My name is Saady, it's always such a difficult one to pronounce, S-A-A-D-Y. So I originally went to art college, actually. I did a foundation course in art about 30 years ago. And during that, I saw Architecture at the Crossroads, which was a series that the BBC were running at the time. And I don't know if you may recall, there was Prince Charles with his carbuncle extensions to the National Gallery. So sort of conservation architecture was very much in the news at the time. And I went on to study architecture at Plymouth. During the holidays, I was lucky enough to have work in a conservation architecture practice. So from the very start, I was very much aware of conservation, particularly this was a countryside practice. We used to do a lot of timber framed buildings, and I absolutely adore timber frame buildings. You know, I've been on site where you literally can rack a chain around it as you're starting to rack it back up into shape. They're very flexible. But as I went through my architecture training, I got more and more interested in sustainability. It was not something that was popular at the time. I was very much ridiculed at college, in fact, for being that way. But my final project was combining heritage, finding old remains of a lime kiln, and building a poetry exchange around it, using the heritage to inform the way the architecture formed. So then I went on, after I qualified as an architect, I went on to do an MSc in energy efficient building. That was sort of like about 25 years ago. And that was sort of like, then I went into building my own practice, having children, getting married. And then around about 3 or 4 years ago, I realized that I wanted to get some formal qualifications to ratify my 30-year experience in the historic building environment, and started the MSc in energy efficient building, conservation of the historic environment at Reading University with Henry. And as a result of that, I learned about the IHBC, which I'd not actually heard of before, right. And subsequently took the extra sort of effort to fill in all the forms and submit an application and became a full member in June.
All right, very impressive. Sorry about the name pronunciation.
Yes, sorry, I should have said that before.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about retrofit design. So just sort of starting at the top, what is a retrofit and what are you trying to achieve?
So for me, I mean, obviously retrofit is something to lots of different people, but to me, a retrofit is ostensibly to improve the thermal performance of the building and enable you to reduce your reliance on fossil fuels or even become carbon neutral. It's this fantastic kind of like chasing figure that you're looking for. It's a bit nebulous, I'll be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of, I mean, do you see different styles of retrofit? I mean, I know there's a lot of different terms. I've come across deep retrofit, responsible retrofit, fabric first approach. You know, what do these different terms sort of mean, or styles? Or do you have a particular style, do you think, or is it just sort of dependent on the building and the project?
Well, ostensibly, I've been retrofitting for quite a long time. So for me, it's improving the energy efficiency of the building, which I learnt about in my MSc all that time ago. But retrofit varies completely from building to building. Obviously, I think there's a lot of great pressure at the moment, isn't there, to make our heritage buildings supposedly perform to higher standards or consume less energy. But I actually don't think necessarily the information is correct about the energy they consume in the first place. So I think retrofit needs to be very much about the individual house. So if you've got a sort of 1960s cavity building, that's got obvious low-hanging fruit, which is very different from, say, a solid wall construction. And I think perhaps a good example of retrofit is the very building where I am now, which is a late Victorian cavity, and I have caused harm by filling the cavities, which have subsequently had taken out. So I think the style of retrofit, it has absolutely everything to do with the age of the building and the way, and also actually where it's positioned in terms of the elements as well. I would probably overall seek to achieve higher comfort levels with retrofit.
Right. Okay. That's a good metric. Regarding historic buildings and buildings with sort of heritage significance, how do you approach this sort of idea that you're changing bits of the building, but conserving the significance as well? And how do you go about sort of balancing those?
So I ought to say that my views aren't the IHBC's views as well, which is quite important. Because I don't really think that there is much you can do to historic buildings that have got these features. Retrofitting is going to destroy those features that give them that architectural or historical significance. And there's not really a lot you can do unless the best thing to do for retrofit really is maintaining your building, making sure it's not leaking, and then possibly looking at the airtightness in those historic buildings. You know, when you've got internal features as well as external features, just make sure the existing fabric's working the way it was meant to work. I mean, obviously, if you've got like a flat ceiling, you can put insulation in that, but you need to be really, really, really careful of what you do in case you harm the building, because there are things that I've done, 5-10 years ago that I certainly wouldn't do now, because you've just caused interstitial condensation within the structure. So I don't know if you know what that is. That's when you insulate, you change the rate at which warm, moist air moves and enters into the building fabric. And if it cools down too quickly, which is called the dew point, it then causes condensation, which can cause rot. And it's not good for the health of the building either, or the health of the occupants.
Right, absolutely. And so that tends to happen on what we might call a traditional building, or a building of traditional construction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's been estimated that around a third of the UK housing stock is of this sort of type. So I was going to ask you about that. Do you think the sort of some of the more common approaches these days don't take this into account, or could handle it better?
Actually, I to be honest with you, I think great advances have been made in the understanding of retrofit, and there's certainly a resurgence towards more natural materials now than there were a while ago. I mean, I don't know if you know, but it's literally only about 2% of our building products. The rest aren't. So I would always go for more natural breathing materials. If you could, lime parging before you maybe have an internal lining that also has a ventilated cavity between, so you're covering all bases of breathability. But with solid wall, with solid walls. So when you say traditional, you're talking about solid walls, aren't you, rather than cavity walls?
Yeah, I think that's a distinction I've seen. I mean, because it's just such a different approach and different sort of building pathology. Mm-hmm. And along those lines, I wanted to ask, there's a lot of new materials out there. They're new, but they're more traditional, or they're made of local materials, things like insulating lime, wool, battens, these sorts of things. Do you use a lot of these sorts of products on your projects?
I think a lot of the time we're reinventing the wheel, actually. A lot of these products have been around for a long time, but just nobody was using them and nobody was hearing them. I think in the deep green world, we all knew about them, but the heritage world was just anti-anything. Don't touch anything. They've only just recently started really taking it on board, haven't they? That they need to start addressing the energy efficiency. Wood fiber, all those kind of products, I think they've been around for a good sort of 40 or 50 years. It's just that they're now in the news in a way that people didn't realize they were before.
Okay, and so you're seeing them used more often than on sort of retrofit projects?
Yeah, I mean, if you eventually think, I mean, wattle and daub is essentially like an old-fashioned insulating material, isn't it?
Yeah.
and I just wish more research was I mean, I know there's been tons and tons of research, and obviously in this lockdown, there is just like so many webinars and so many seminars around now that it's quite difficult to not know where you're coming from in terms of, you know, what you should do. But I think the basic premise is that we've got these products, they've been around for a while. Let's use them and stop trying to reinvent the wheel.
Right, right. No, that's very interesting. So how do you approach ventilation? Because a lot of traditional buildings will have had sort of passive ventilation, and that can be quite energy intensive at times. So
through leakiness.
Yeah, I mean, do you seal it all up and do mechanical ventilation, or do you do a bit of a
I
combination? Or
I do, but I wouldn't do that in an old building. I just would not do that in an old building. So yes, I'm a massive advocate of passive house. We follow passive house principles in the work that we do, and the whole basis is looking at the fabric first. And I still think that premise should be the way you look at old buildings as well. I certainly think that.
okay, so can you explain what a fabric first approach is?
First, sorry. I'm so used to these ways of saying. So basically, you know, everyone always wants to be energy efficient, and they think that putting a solar panel on is the way to be energy efficient, and it isn't. You have to look at the fabric of the building first. That's the much more cost-effective way of redressing your energy usage in occupation. So looking at the air tightness is really critical in a modern building. I put mechanical ventilation and heat recovery. So you insulate well, you seal it really tightly, and then you artificially ventilate it with heat recovery. But that kind of air tightness in an old building can cause significant harm. And I've done this in my own bedroom, and I had a leaky old window, removed it, put loads of insulation in, and now it smells of damp. And I know that's condensation. So that's what you need to be really careful of. So yes, we do put in insulation, we do highly insulate, but we do make sure that it's well ventilated at the same time. The amount of insulation you can put in an old building is not the same that you can in a new building, because again, that buildup of moisture control, the buildup of the wall, basically you can't put loads of insulation in. It just doesn't stack up.
Yeah, you'll end up with
work.
wet walls.
It causes you problems. Yes.
Now, what I've come across, a mitigating factor perhaps, you talk about the thermal mass of traditional walls. Can you talk about that a little bit, and how you account for that? So the idea is, right, that these walls are very thick, they have a lot of material, and they can hold heat usually for better or worse. So they sort of can help steady out maybe the heat of the day and the cool of the night. But how do you go about calculating these things when you're doing a design, or do you?
There are programs where you can take accounts. You know, we thermally model our buildings, so that kind of the nature of the wall buildup will be taken account of in those calculations. I'm a massive thermal mass fan personally. I just love it. I think you get a big thick wall, make sure that you're not leaking air necessarily, and you've got yourself a really good building. So thermal mass is just, it's a crucial part of overheating and preparing for the future and for climate change, because obviously it has the ability to regulate the temperatures so that when it's hot, it absorbs, and then during the night it can radiate the heat back into the space. So it's invaluable, absolutely invaluable.
Great.
Key part of the way I design, actually. I prefer masonry personally, but I think if you're going to start talking about embodied energy, masonry's got much higher embodied energy levels than, say, timber frame.
Right.
So
well,
that's
I was going to ask.
conversation.
Yeah, no, it is, and I wanted to ask you about that too. You know, when we talk about carbon and embodied carbon, and you know, have you started to use this, looking at sort of repurposing materials, or looking at sort of the carbon costs of retrofits, and versus, you know, the different case scenarios of a do nothing approach, a retrofit approach, a different retrofit approach, perhaps?
So I think in the past, when say like 10 or 15 years ago, when I was, 20 years, when I was just jumping for joy that the word sustainability was actually even appearing in our planning system, I was very much fixated on reducing energy use in consumption. and I didn't really care about embodied energy. So some of my one-off bespoke houses have got huge embodied energy levels, even though they're zero carbon. And it's all about where the payback comes. Like, you've paid back from that carbon. And I do think the heritage people, we say, oh, well, it's got no carbon embodied energy because we've used all that, in the occupation. And there is an argument for that. You're not adding to the carbon, are you, with an old building? But really what we need to be focusing on is energy use and consumption. And I think that occupant behaviour is actually a key way to reduce energy consumption for our heritage buildings. And a lot of people are already doing that. Say when they live in large places, they'll reduce down to 2 or 3 rooms in the winter. That has just as much, I think that's just as pertinent as getting tied down with the embodied energy question, which isn't about energy use in occupation, which is what we need to address now.
So along those lines, talk about the performance gap a little bit. So you may plan for a particular outcome, and then you go back and you perhaps have a different outcome. And a lot of times that can be because of installation, maybe differences or defects, or maybe it's occupant behavior. So how do you go about trying to sort of minimize the performance gap?
I remember when this information came out with the performance gap, and it all originates from the way we started calculating energy use, wasn't it? So we used to have code for sustainable homes, which took account of where a house was actually positioned. So if you weren't near village shops, you wouldn't get the points and that sort of thing. And then we moved on to, they were based on SAP, Standard Assessment Procedure, which in itself, unfortunately, is very flawed and very oversimplified. So, with the EPC ratings, they're often completely wrong, actually. They don't necessarily correlate with the energy performance of a building. So I think the energy gap is, the performance gap is all about the way people calculate it in the first place is wrong. Right. And that maybe that's actually what needs to be addressed. I think builders I've seen on sites, I'm seeing very different approaches from builders now than I was in the past. They're much more aware of what needs to be done. When you're fitting windows, there's wonderful expanding tapes that you can put around to stop air leakage, those sort of things. But I don't see how our current calculation procedures that we have will address that, because it's not in there yet, I don't think.
Yeah, it's almost not granular enough to capture some of these things.
Yeah.
And, okay, so what about occupants? You mentioned how some people may be condensed down to only living in a few rooms over the winter or something. I mean, when you go about a retrofit project, do you talk quite a bit with the occupants and maybe come up with different solutions based on how they use their space? I mean, is that?
I think the most important thing I learned was that you have to get a building retrofit ready, which will take about 25% of your budget. I have very rarely been approached just for doing a retrofit. Most people want to do an extension, and invariably I find that the retrofit suffers at the cost of it. Individual retrofit just, sadly, if full house retrofit just doesn't stack up financially if you are looking for the financial savings on those CO2 savings, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But often when I'm approached to do retrofit, they're with people who are already living mindfully.
Okay.
If that makes
sure.
sense.
Yeah.
So their occupant behavior is already quite, they're not flying, they're not doing the expensive holiday abroad, they're not running the big flash cars, perhaps. They're maybe, or walking, they're cycling. Those kind of occupant behavior things that a lot of people wouldn't be prepared to give those up, and they don't see that as part of the occupant behavior pattern. I'm talking as a real eco nut here, so I apologies to everyone who's listening who does enjoy those things, like new clothes, for instance, that sort of thing as well. I know you're trying to focus on occupant behaviours, turning down the thermostat, wearing thermals, warm boots, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that sort of range.
Really careful with retrofit, because you can damage the building.
Well, do you see? I mean, a lot of talk about how getting. You mentioned retrofit ready. Stopping leaks and getting the fabric to perform the way it's supposed to in the beginning.
Yeah.
Do you see, I mean, are there good resources for saying, okay, here's some of the things you can do to get your way on the way to a retrofit, or to help increase the efficiency of your building without going and, like you mentioned, spending a load of money that you're not going to see a financial return on? Are there these low-hanging fruit in some of the more traditional older buildings?
There is low-hanging fruit. I don't have a method that I use to calculate that. I'm sure there are methods. I mean, the Passive House Planning Pack, which is a hugely sophisticated and fantastic calculation method, takes account of just the reveals in windows for the effect that it has on the energy and the energy use of a building. So when I design or when I work, that's the way I consider everything.
Right. So people would probably come to you with a big project in mind. I'm guessing they don't come to you for little bits here and there over the years.
Not really. I mean, I think what you need to look at buildings in terms of physics. So buildings, if you imagine that you've got a goldfish bowl and it's full of water, but there's the holes in that goldfish bowl, the water will pour out. And heat is exactly like the same. I've visualized buildings as these kind of vessels. So if you see a concrete lintel over a window, that's creating a thermal bypass. So the heat is pouring out through that thermal bypass. And that's the way I look at every building. So if someone came to me and say, oh, here's my building, I would assess the building in terms of looking at where all the potential junctions might be that could cause problems that you could improve. There are low hanging fruit, aren't there? Like insulating flat ceilings. I think I said that earlier.
Yeah.
Secondary glazing, things like that. But there are also other things like shutters and curtains, thick carpets that can help a lot better, and they're not usually taken account of in things like EPCs or programs.
And what about offices? Does it sort of hold true? Because I know you do a bit of office design as well. Do you find office clients are a little bit different or have different objectives, or is it easier or harder to do in office?
Overheating is always the issue we get in offices. We end up having to provide solar shading across the windows, because if you insulate, overheating is the major problem facing our modern buildings. You insulate really well, you seal them tight, and you get those incidental heat gains, and you've not properly designed it so you've shaded the building. And that's what I found with offices, because they like big windows. You need to make sure that you've considered the whole thing in occupation.
Right. I imagine all the computing equipment we have in a modern office plays into that quite a bit as well.
Yeah, it really does, yeah. Not the hot air that comes from discussions in the office.
Well, thank you, Joe. That was a very stimulating conversation. I'd like to wrap up just by asking you, in your estimation, what does the future look like, or should it look like, in terms of sustainability and conservation of the built environment?
That's quite a large question, that one, isn't it? To be honest with you, I'm quite scared about the future, because CO2, it's still rising. We're still consuming constantly. And I think our way of life is just geared towards that. I think the heritage is actually really quite protected, really well protected. We've got a lot of legislation in place that means that I think it's a lot easier to not do anything than to do something. So I think that is actually quite an issue for the future. I'm not overly hopeful for the future, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's rather bleak, Joe.
I suppose you can't give up hope, can you? It is fantastic that there are so many people who are now embracing sustainability, and I think there's huge amounts that can be done, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that people need to want to do it.